Mesdames et Messieurs les députés,
Dear members of Parliament, before beginning this general policy declaration, I would first like to tell you about the emotion that I felt, and I'm sure every one of you felt this emotion as well, when we all took part in this minute of silence in the memory of Philippine. We all are thinking of her and her family, and we are all thinking about all the women who are victims of gender-based violence. Madam Speaker, MPs,
and Mark is still waiting for his translation.
I'm taking the floor in front of you for the first time as Prime Minister. And I'm aware of the seriousness and the gravity, the importance of this moment for our common action at the service of our country and our fellow citizens who are watching us and listening to us right now. At this instance, I have in my mind the order given by General de Gaulle to the people in May 1942, a message that he gave one of his aides de camp from London, to a certain Pierre de Chevigné, who he had sent to London in order to create he had actually sent him to the United States to create a unit of Free France. And he wrote to him, I'm going to ask you to do a lot with very little, and starting with almost nothing. Decades later, at a juncture that was luckily less dramatic, this need to do a lot with very little is now the daily life of many of our fellow citizens. Policemen and women, gendarmes, firefighters, soldiers who ensure our collective security, all in conditions that are constantly more difficult. Our nurses, our doctors have less and less time to heal, to help more and more people. Our teachers, our trainers, who also are under stress to teach citizenship to our children, people with disabilities, people who are fighting to have access and who are fighting against discrimination. I'm thinking of the volunteers who devote their time and energy for others. I'm thinking about the parents who have difficulty in having ends meet and making ends meet. And I'm also thinking of the children from poor families who, thanks to the education of our Republican schools, manage to follow their desired career paths. Dear elected representatives, we are collectively at a critical moment. We need to do a lot. And if we can't do everything, we need to do well in order to meet the expectations of our fellow citizens. And we need to do this with few resources. In a situation where we have limited resources. But inversely to de Gaulle's words, we are not starting from scratch or starting from nothing. Our starting point with our government is based on a popular vote that elected you all, my dear colleagues, elected representatives, which show that we are at a difficult moment. We need more efficient social services, securities in our everyday life. But we also need to find a path to fraternity, peace, and hope. We are starting from a position of strength. France is strong. We have a capacity of innovation of those who work, who produce, who are entrepreneurs here in France, in mainland France, and abroad, and in our overseas territories. These last years, and I believe this objectively and personally, that we have progressed in recent years under the impulse of the head of state and his different governments. We are also starting with a France that is rich in history, rich in heritage, rich in its biodiversity and landscapes on earth and in the sea. We are starting with France that was able to unite itself in order to encourage our Olympic and Paralympic athletes. People sang the Marseillaise proudly, and at the end of the day, we surprised the world. I think these assets, ladies and gentlemen, these assets are things that I have in mind now, after being named Prime Minister by the President of the Republic 26 days ago today. I am here to present to you our roadmap, the roadmap of our new government, which is based on one double requirement. Firstly, a method which is my own, and we will also have 5 main working projects. First of all, when it comes to the expectations, we need to reduce our double budget and environmental debt. Our fellow citizens expect us to look truth in the eyes, and they expect the Prime Minister and the members of government to tell the truth. And as I committed to this, I will say the truth. On the truth of our public accounts and on the reality of the impact of our lifestyle, our economy on the environment. I heard people speak about a Damocles sword that would be dangling over the head of the government. But the true Damocles sword is actually dangling over the heads of the French men and women today. We need action and courage. And I'm sure that this sword will weigh over us even more heavily in the future on our children and grandchildren if we do not act today. 3,228 billion euros in public debt. And this figure might push our country over the edge of a precipice. Our public debt might be above 6% of our GDP by the end of this year. And if we don't do anything, it will even be greater in 2025. Why is this a serious problem, dear elected representatives? Not only because these figures have nothing to do with the projections that were made at the beginning of the year, not only because they have nothing to do by the pathways that were promised by our partners, not only because this situation is reverberated by the situation in Europe, but also because the burden of this debt, 51 billion euros, is now the second expense of our state after education. Is it acceptable that we should spend more to pay interest to others than we pay for our defense or research? The answer today is no. When it comes to our challenges, which are huge, we have no other choice. Our responsibility is to reduce this burden and find a greater budgetary wiggle room. So, my first commitment is to bring the deficit down to 5% in 2025. Our goal is to put our country on the right trajectory in order to get under the ceiling of 3% by 2029, which is in line with our European commitments. How can we do this? We are not fibbing here, and I am not going to tell you lies. Our public spending represents 57% of our GDP, whereas in Europe the average is 49%. They have gone up by over 3 trillion euros since 2019. This represents 5,000 euros in public spending on top for every French person every year, regardless of their age. The first remedy to fight this debt is reducing spending. In 2025, two-thirds of the effort to reduce our debt will come from reducing our spending. Reducing government spending is to turn our back on the idea that everything is free or everything is subsidized. We need to make choices, responsible ones. And I'm using this word responsible in a very grave way. We need to improve people's lives in the long term. We will have to take particular care to protect the most fragile people so that they're protected by health measures, the public education system and social security. So we will be working with local governments in order to make the right choices. So we will reduce spending. And the second remedy is to be more efficient in our government spending. We are champions of government spending, but what is the result of this spending? Is it normal that the cost of educating a French student be superior to that of educating our neighbors, whereas our teachers are often less well paid? Is it acceptable that state services rent out spaces in the middle of Paris, whereas actually rent places in central Paris, whereas they could move to nearby areas which are cheaper, and this would improve the situation on the ground in these other places, which we saw with the Olympics in the Seine-Saint-Denis department. We will be looking out for abuses of the system, for corruption, and to unjustified expenses. So we need to reduce public spending. It needs to be more efficient. The third remedy is a tax remedy. Our taxes are among the highest in the world. The tax reductions that were taken in the last 7 years and the measures taken during the COVID crisis helped many French people. This is very true, and many companies as well. And it also gave them oxygen to breathe in a situation that was unprecedented and difficult. But the situation of our public accounts today require a targeted effort that will be limited in time, a shared effort in order to obtain a tax justice. Sharing these efforts will push us to ask for greater participation by the largest companies who will have to do their part. We will not make our competitiveness suffer. We can't distribute our wealth if there isn't production and activity and economic activity in our country. We will also ask an exceptional contribution of the richest and the wealthiest French people in order to avoid a situation where the largest taxpayers would be untaxed. And we will also fight against tax fraud and social fraud. So we will also secure our national health cards to combat the undeserved social benefits. On these budgetary issues, there will be very important choices to be made. They will be made with you when we will discuss the budget. The draft finance law, which has been prepared with a great sense of urgency. Prime Minister has never had to present a budget in so little time. This draft law takes into account this need for straightening our budget, and so our accounts rather. And so I would like the Parliament to be able to debate this point and improve the budget if necessary. We need a good budgetary policy, and that is something that needs to be far-sighted. And so I would like our ministers and members of parliament to work productively, and I'd like everyone to take their responsibilities, especially the directors of central administrations. My fellow dear MPs, there is another Damocles' sword that is just as dangerous that is dangling over us, and that is that of the environmental debt. We do not inherit the land of our ancestors. And we leave it to our children. This is something that I have always remembered since the beginning of my political career, as when I worked under the French Ministry of the Environment in my region of Savoie. I worked in the Ministry, in the Senate, in the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Fisheries, and at the European Commission. And I've always defended the environment, and it will be at the heart of our political actions. Because I remember the recommendation of a head of state, or a statesman rather, a statesman whom I respected, Pierre Mendès France, who recommended that we should never sacrifice the future in the name of the present. Never sacrifice the future in the name of the present. Some say, what's the use? What can France do when faced with a problem that the entire world is faced with? Well, I think that we can do a lot. Our greenhouse gas emissions went down by 3.6% during the first half of 2024. This shows that our efforts have paid off. We can and we will do more to fight climate change and to prevent all the risks that are much more frequent and violent. We need to preserve our biodiversity. We need to encourage the circular economy. We need to act more concretely within the EU and under the Paris agreements. And we need to encourage the different initiatives by our local authorities, by our different companies and individuals around the country. Our environmental policy has to be an engine of our industrial policy. We need to decarbonate our factories. We need to decarbonize our factories, and we need to encourage innovation. We need to encourage new transition industries. We need to strengthen the sector of recycling. I believe in an environmentalism that brings forth solutions. We will also be working on the energy mix by encouraging nuclear development, the development of nuclear power plants, including new nuclear reactors. But we will also be developing renewable sources of energy by better measuring, and I'm thinking about wind turbines, for example, by better measuring all their impacts. We will also encourage the use of biomass to produce gas and heat. We will develop biofuels for the aviation industry in France and in our overseas territories, who have a goal of 100% of renewable energy by 2030. We will launch innovative laboratories for solar and geothermal energy. And so together we will have to control our energy needs by being more economical and more targeted. We will better target the support of individuals and companies for the thermal renovation of buildings. The energy diagnostics system will be simplified, as will its timeline. The state, working with the largest landowners in the countries, has to also set an example. And so we will reduce our energy expenses by reducing the spaces that we manage. At the same time, planning works will also pick up immediately. The French energy climate project, the adaptation plan to climate change, the new pluriannual plan for energy. These are tools that we have in our hands and that we will use. I'd like to say a last couple of words on this topic about water. Whether it's floods or droughts, pollution of our land, we have to take into account the different works that have been taken and the discussions that have been done in recent years. We need to develop our strategy on water. And so we plan to launch a large national conference to act on this question of water. These two realities, the budgetary pressure and the climate pressure, some people want to deny them or turn a blind eye on them. Some of them passively are passive when faced with them or just comment on them. But I think sticking our head in the sand does nothing good. We cannot be fatalistic. I don't think politicians have the right to be fatalistic. So I'm convinced that we can be realistic and find a pathway through action, by working through a contract rather than through constraints, and that this will allow us to build new trust in our governments. Ladies and gentlemen, MPs, please look at the situation with lucid eyes. We need to look at the political juncture we now found ourselves in. The Parliament has been divided in a way it hasn't been since 1958. No political party managed to get an absolute majority in the last parliamentary elections, neither alone nor with their allies. It is what the French people have chosen, and it's the reality in our National Assembly today. But our fellow citizens would not forgive us if we do nothing in the 3 years ahead of us. And they are asking us for urgent remedies, urgent answers to several large questions. The first, fast access to quality healthcare near them. How to be able to live with dignity from your work and your retirement funds. How to ensure security and public services in the different areas, in the villages and neighborhoods of France. To answer each of these questions in the very specific political situation we're in today, we need a new method. First of all, we need to listen, we need to be respectful, and we need dialogue. Listening, respect, and dialogue between the government and the parliament. I will ask my government to base itself more on parliamentary work when it comes to draft legislation, to amendments, to recommendations for investigations, to assessments of public policies, and so on. For the political groups here in the National Assembly or in the Senate, some of whose members are now members of the government, and I'd like to thank them for their support. I'd also like to thank all the other groups. I'd like there to be fewer texts, and I think I'd like there to be more time to debate the different draft laws. I'm also ready to share the agenda better between the government and the parliament, according to Article 48 of the Constitution, in order to welcome cross-party draft laws. This has been done in the past with the organic law or the finance law, and I think we could do this in future for other laws on disability, for example. So we need to listen, we need to be respectful, and we need to take into account all the different political forces and all the different political sensitivities at the National Assembly and in the Senate. So from the get-go, we will listen to and respect each and every one of you, even if this respect is not always reciprocal.
Enfin,
I've also heard calls for greater representativity, and I am ready, the government is ready, to work without ideology on a proportional vote. This is already something that has been done in the Senate and in local governments, and there have been different practices among many of our neighboring countries. We need to listen, we need to respect, we need to work with our social partners, and I'd like to be able to listen to all the partners from the trade unions and the business world, who I met with this last week. And I think the situation we're faced with needs a renewal of the social dialogue. And we need a new relation with the state, a constructive relation. I trust the social partners to negotiate, starting in the following weeks, on senior employment, on our unemployment benefit system. I think that these actors are best placed to bring forth solutions. When it comes to the pension reform, we will also need to launch or relaunch the dialogue. We need to ensure our retirement system. The vote that was the law that was voted on the 15th of April 2023 may have to be corrected. The question of progressive pension funds, the question of male-female equality when it comes to pensions, all these things need to be worked on. So we need to ask our social partners to think of possible changes to the law. We need to listen, we need to have a dialogue, we need to work with local partners, local authorities who every day show courage and commitment. For a very long time now, I've had a very noble idea of the local authorities of our republic. After 40 years after our law on decentralization, we have to create a new relationship between the local authorities and the central state. We respect the competences of each local authority, and we need to reinforce these competences too and strengthen them. And so the Prime Minister will work with the elected representatives and the representatives of local authorities, especially of Corsica. So listening, respecting, and taking into account the needs of and the ideas of French people on the ground, who often have very good solutions that they can bring forth too. Good ideas don't always come from up above. You also need to listen to people on the ground. That is something I'm convinced of. And that is why, Madam Speaker, dear MPs, there's an idea I want to work on, something that, Madam Speaker, you also defended, to organize a yearly day of citizens' consultations. On this day, this is an idea that I have, it is something that, of course, we'll have to debate on, a day when all the doors would be open and internet could be used, and at each level of our all different authorities, from villages, departments, the state, everyone would be able to ask a question to the citizens and open up a debate on various topics. Listening, being respectful, an open dialogue, and then finally, 3 million French people live in our overseas territories, and they also support our country in 3 different oceans. Our 12 overseas territories are an essential part of our country, and our government will maintain a dialogue with these territories and in respecting their diversity, their specificities, their culture, and by maintaining good relations with their elected representatives. There are representatives present here today, and I will preside during the first quarter of 2025 on an interministerial meeting of the representatives overseas territories and with the employers' organizations in order to bring greater benefit to the local population. We also need to fight against the cost of living, which has also affected our co-citizens in these overseas territories. If you allow me, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say a couple of words about New Caledonia, whom I would like to welcome their elected representatives who are here with us today in Parliament. It has now been 4.5 months since an extremely serious crisis has hit New Caledonia. I am aware of the anxiety and the difficulties that have hit the inhabitants of this territory, and I'd like to tell them that my government will be working with them. And I'd like to salute and commend all those who are working to appease the local situation, the representatives of state, the trade union representatives, the local representatives, the various players from the religious sphere, from business sphere, and so on and so forth. We need to open up a new period that will be devoted to rebuilding the social and economic fabric of New Caledonia. We will need to work politically on its institutional future, and this will be based on everyone's convictions, and we will respect the diversity of the people of New Caledonia, all the while respecting democratic principles. I commit to this personally, and I'd like to thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the President of the Speaker of the Senate, because you both agreed to undertake a mission of dialogue and consultation that will go to New Caledonia soon. In order to guarantee that all the different issues of New Caledonia are taken into account, discussions have been launched in Paris and in New Caledonia by an interministerial.
Well, you've been listening there to Michel Barnier, the French president, speaking at the National Assembly, giving his inaugural address there as Prime Minister, setting out some of his policy agendas for the months ahead. Our French politics editor, Mark Perelman, has been listening to that with me. He's with me now. And Mark, let's start by looking at the atmosphere at the National Assembly in the room, because particularly at the beginning, some tensions were rather evident with left-wing MPs.
Yes, and throughout the part of the whole speech we heard shouts and so on, but at the very beginning, the members of France Unbowed raised their voting cards.
Yeah.
This is a way for them to say that the voters had not been listened to. By appointing Michel Barnier, there are only 47 MPs out of 577 MPs from his Conservative Party, but he is the Prime Minister addressing Parliament for his inaugural policy speech today. So this was a way for them to convey the message that the voters' wishes hadn't been respected. And throughout the speech, we heard shouts from the left, jeers, and so on. Clearly, this is a very fractious National Assembly. It was already we had lots of controversy, shouting, and so on since the re-election of Emmanuel Macron in 2022, the ensuing legislative elections, which ended up with Macron's camp having a relative majority. But this was, I would say, far easier than now, where you really have the most divided National Assembly since the Fifth Republic, as Michel Barnier pointed himself out in the speech. So obviously not an easy start for the Prime Minister in terms of how he was received in the National Assembly.
And in terms of substance, Mark, no surprise really that a lot of his focus so far has been on the French economy.
Yes, he started by quoting General de Gaulle, obviously an inspiration for the Gaullist Michel Barnier during World War II, saying we have to do a lot, but we have very few assets on our side. And he was essentially using this as a comparison to say, I come in as prime minister at a very, very difficult time. We're really on the edge of the razor, and the situation is dire. And he said, we have two huge debts. The fiscal debt, he said it's colossal. France will have more than 6% of GDP deficit in 2025. And he said, we need to address this. We cannot ignore this. This is a threat to our well-being, our children's well-being. And so he put out the objective of bringing this deficit to 5% next year, and hopefully under the 3% required by the European Union by 2029. And he also said we have another debt, it's the environmental debt. And he insisted on the need to be more efficient when it comes to the energy. So when it was for the fiscal debt, who was probably trying to please the right and the Macron camp, and on the green debt, quote unquote, hopefully trying to get some favor from the left, or at least from the Green Party. And he explained how he would address this debt, more efficiency for the environment. But everyone was waiting for what he would say in terms of reducing the debt and the deficit. He said 2/3 of the effort would be to cut into public spending. France is spending more than all its neighbors. It's too much and it's not efficient enough. So we need really to make an effort. But he also said that a third of this effort would be by, yes, raising taxes. He obviously qualified this. It would only be a targeted, limited, temporary tax hike for big and very big companies making a lot of money. He didn't go into details. And also an exceptional contribution, quote unquote, for the most rich people here in France. He didn't go into details. He said those who work and earn a living would be spared. But nevertheless, this is what the Macron camp had warned against. We don't want higher taxes. Michel Barnier said, I have no choice. Given the situation I'm facing, we'll have to raise taxes, not for everyone, only on a temporary basis, but we have to do this.
And just a final thought from you, Mark, on his tone again, because when he was talking about pensions, for example, he did seem to be trying to suggest, look, I'm listening to the concerns of the French people. I want to have dialogue with French people on this issue. Perhaps that stands in slight contrast to how people sometimes see the president, Emmanuel Macron.
In sharp contrast, I would argue, because clearly Michel Barnier said, I have a method. I'm here to listen. Obviously, he knows that the math in the National Assembly are not in favor, that he has a very, very fragile situation on his hands, that he could be pushed aside by a motion of defiance any time, and the budget vote will be a key moment, the first test for him. And so he said, yes, I'm going to listen, there's going to be respect, and there's going to be dialogue. Decisions will not be handed down from the very top. This is obviously what Emmanuel Macron has been accused of doing. And he said, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen to the regions, the departments in France. France is a deeply centralized country. He said, we need really to make an effort also to try to talk to the unions. He's talked to some of them, and he said, for example, the very, very controversial pension reform passed a year ago. There were huge protests in Parliament, but also on the streets of France. He said, we should make some reasonable and fair adjustments to see if we can improve this law. So this was a way for him to show an olive branch to the unions and maybe to the left to show that he's not only a man of the right, not only a man of the alliance between the Macron camp and the conservative, but someone who could reach across the aisle in the deeply fractious parliament. He said that there would not be a vote of confidence after the speech. It's usually the case, although his two predecessors didn't take the risk because there was a risk that they could lose this motion of no confidence. But clearly, the first test will be in 10 days or so when his government will present the budget to Parliament.
Mark Perelman, thanks very much indeed for your analysis there on Michel Barnier's first major speech to the National Assembly.